So I wanted to talk about this alleged phenomenon that has been going around, which is the phenomenon of performative reading. People who have the nerve to read classics in public or post social media posts about their reading experiences. A lot of this stuff is targeted towards men, especially when it comes to this idea of reading classics in public, but there's also a strand of it that is targeted at women as well. So I'll look at both sides of this, the ways in which men seem to get blamed for performative reading and the ways that women do as well. And I'll argue that I think that most of this is just nonsense and possibly is a sign of people who probably don't read, or maybe they have questionable literary taste, projecting their own insecurities onto people who do read the classics or who have social media platforms that are perhaps better than the ones that they have. So I'll begin by talking about those performative readers, typically men, at least if the articles that I've been reading are to be believed, who have the nerve to read classic novels in public. I will point out that it seems somewhat ironic to me that on the one hand, we've also had a lot of articles in recent months and years complaining and shaming men for not reading enough, and then for those few men that do have the nerve to read in public, they then get shamed because they're not really reading and people question their motives. So I do find that to be quite ironic. And we might think that actually if some men do read in public, that could be a benefit regardless of what their motivations are, because it actually shows other men that reading is something that a man can do and that he shouldn't feel ashamed of. But nevertheless, we're in the 2020s, and so instead of having a positive view of something, we have to take the most cynical explanation possible instead. And so the idea behind performative reading is that if you see that man who is reading, he's not actually reading. What he's doing is he's performing. You notice how he's only read like the first 5 pages of the book? That's because he's not read most of it and he's just doing it as a pretense. You notice how he's sitting in a very prominent position in the cafe, right next to the window, so the light's fully on him, so you can see him in prominence. That's because he wants you to look at him. And if you notice that he's reading Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Dickens, he's only doing that because he wants you to think that he's very intelligent. Now, a less cynical person, and arguably a less stupid person, might argue that the reason why he has just started this book is perhaps as someone who enjoys reading. He's just been to a bookshop, he's just picked up this book, and now he's reading it. You might wonder whether the reason why he's sitting in that particular spot in the cafe is because the light is coming through the window, and so it's not about him making himself visible to others, but making the book more visible to himself so he can read it. And maybe he's picked a classic novel because classics, if you want to read the best, classics typically are the best. That's not to say that obviously new books aren't great too, they are, but if you want to read the best, classics are a good way to start. So maybe that's why he's chosen to read that book. But no, apparently not. Apparently this is just performance. And there's a big emphasis in these articles about this idea that it's the public nature of what he's doing. It's the fact that he's doing this in public, which somehow takes away from the alleged intimate experience that reading is supposed to provide. And I think that this is ultimately just a load of rubbish. Maybe there's a reason why you're so offended by this. Maybe seeing someone reading a classic novel in public makes you look at your own habit of just staring into the abyss of your mobile phone, looking at brain-dead content for hours on end. Maybe it calls that into question and makes you feel insecure. Maybe the fact that he's reading a great novel while your literary taste is either non-existent or quite poor, maybe that also makes you feel quite insecure. So rather than projecting your insecurity onto others, why don't you look inward and think about why it is exactly that someone having the nerve to just read a book in public, which is something that a few years ago many people did and no one questioned it, why don't you look inward to yourself and think about why this might be offending you, and maybe the problem is with you rather than with the person who just wants to read a book over a coffee, and be left alone. Also, just because someone decides to read a book in public, it doesn't mean that they're putting on a performance. When I go to the shop, I'm not putting on a performance for anyone. I have a place, I want to get there, and therefore I need to go to where I'm going. If I want to go out and enjoy a drink in a pub, I'm not performing for anyone. I want to have a drink in a pub because it's a nice atmosphere. And also, maybe I want to read in a public place because I like reading in a bar. It's cozy, it's quiet, I don't have people at home pestering me, for example. And so maybe there's a kind of privacy that you can have in public. The idea that the mere fact that you do something in public therefore makes it a performance is ridiculous. Now, people will often point to these things that these guys are doing that somehow makes it performative. They'll criticize them because of the way that they dress, because apparently a man dressing well is also performative, because all men should look like crap, I suppose. Or there was one example of someone complaining that this guy decided to read a book while he was going up an escalator. And again, no one questions people who stare at their phones while they go up an escalator. Maybe he's got to a really good bit of the book and he just wants to get to read it to see where it goes. There's nothing wrong with wanting to break up the monotonous moments in your life by doing something worthwhile. And so again, stop assuming that you know why this person is doing that. Maybe they just really enjoy the book, maybe they're really into it, and that's all there is to say about this. And for my own part, I have to say that I read in public quite a lot. And the reason why I do that is not because I want to put on a show for anyone. It's because oftentimes it's quite a pleasurable thing to do. There's a river near where I live, and it's quite nice to go and sit by that river and just read. There's a bar there are people around. Obviously then people will see me doing that, but that's not on my mind while I'm reading. I'm engrossed in the text, just like they're engrossed in whatever it is they're doing, whether that's having conversations with people or going on their phones. And they're not doing that for performance either. They're just being people in public. And the idea that merely being in public makes something performative is frankly ludicrous. Now I want to look at another kind of so-called performative reading, and this is typically more targeted towards women than men, and it doesn't come up as much in the articles that I read, but it's still certainly a part of it, and I still think that it is mostly nonsense. And this concerns women usually who have social media accounts like TikTok or Instagram where they post book content. Now I'm less familiar with this kind of thing because I don't do that. Obviously, I have the YouTube channel, but mostly I'm talking quite substantively about the books that I review. Whereas with Book Talk or with Instagram, you're sharing superficial content in the sense that it's much shorter. You can't really get into the details of something. And so again, there's this idea that these women or people who use Instagram or TikTok for sharing this content are ultimately just performative. They design their bookshelves, rather like I've done here, for the aesthetic value that it has, rather than making it about, the ease of which to find a book. They post cutesy pictures of reading in really comfy spots in their house. And the idea is that this is all performative. It's supposed to make you feel that this person is very intellectual and a reader and all of this nonsense. And again, I think this completely misunderstands what these people are doing. And actually, these people can still be deep readers while at the same time sharing their hobby on these platforms. The first thing to point out is that when someone shares an image of their bookshelf or of them reading in a cozy spot, for example, I'd argue that what they are doing is they're not trying to convey something substantive about the book necessarily. What they're trying to do, perhaps, is to convey to you through an image how reading that book makes them feel. So the reason why they might take these elaborate pictures where everything is aesthetically designed is not performative in this vapid sense, but instead it's to convey through an image what it feels like to read that book. So if it feels warm and cozy and comforting to read a book, you might take a picture that's with candles and they've got a hot chocolate next to them or whatever. And that's what sharing that kind of content is about. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to remember that we live in a world now where not many people read, and so it can be quite hard to connect with people in person when it comes to reading books. So having these social media interactions can be one way of finding other people who enjoy reading, and then people who share the same taste in books that you do, and then you can have those deeper conversations about books. The fact that you have a TikTok or an Instagram and share pictures about your reading does not mean that you're superficial or fake. Again, it's just this cynical interpretation of what people are doing. And I think this is why this really bugs me. I think that people who read books are doing something worthwhile, and for people to cynically berate these people, whether that's a guy reading in public and dressing well or a girl sharing cutesy Instagram photos while she's reading, is just mean-spirited. And to be honest, I just think it is. I do think genuinely it comes from a place of resentment. Maybe these people don't read themselves, or they are resentful about those girls who have more TikTok followers than them. I don't know what it is, but it just seems to me that the reason for this has probably got more to do with the people complaining than the people who just want to read and share their experiences in public. Now, I want to end this video by considering one of the articles that I read, because a lot of these articles just came across as snarky and irritating, and really I do think they're just bad faith people who cynically misinterpret everything in society. But this article seemed a little bit more considered about the topic, and so I wanted to read that particular passage of this article out and then address it, because while I do think it is somewhat fair-minded, and it does explain, I think, what is at the crux of performative reading. I do think ultimately, though, it's still wrong in a few ways. So the article makes this distinction between performative reading and transformative reading, and it seems to suggest that these kinds of public displays of reading, whether that's reading in public or social media, somehow inhibit your ability to have these transformative reading experiences. And I think that this is fundamentally wrong, but it is an interesting point. So here's what the article says. Performative reading does not necessarily bring out transformation. It serves as a kind of social semaphore. The book becomes a flag planted in the soil of one's digital or interpersonal identity. The selection, framing, and display of the book become the message. It would be lazy to claim that all public reading is insincere. One can read both performatively and attentively. However, the balance between display and interiority has undeniably shifted. When reading becomes a means to an extrinsic end, affirmation, relevance, visibility, it risks flattening the book into a mere token of alignment. Its substance becomes secondary to its optics. Transformative reading, by contrast, does not lend itself easily to display. Its effects are slow, often imperceptible to the outside world. A transformative reading experience might reshape the reader's moral intuitions, deepen their patience for ambiguity, or disturb assumptions too long held. These effects do not photograph well because they do not trend. One could argue that the difference between performative versus transformative reading lies not in the choice of book, but in the posture towards it. While transformative reading is not passive, it also doesn't strive for public recognition. It values inward reckoning over outward approval. It often results in silence, not content. So the article does rightly observe that reading in public doesn't necessarily stop you from having a transformative reading experience, but it does still, it seemed to me, fall into this trap of suggesting that somehow if you're doing something in a public sense, it's going to necessarily inhibit or make more difficult these transformative reading experiences. And I think this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of reading and how we read, and especially how we used to engage with stories in the past. Think of Charles Dickens, who used to do public readings of his novels. The idea that he himself or his audience wouldn't have transformative reading experiences when he was giving these readings is ludicrous, but it was part of a shared public performance. And in fact, it may have even augmented your ability to have that transformative reading experience, to see the author himself inhabiting his characters and his world. You could also think, going even further back in time, the fact that we used to have an oral tradition and that's how we told stories. Again, reading used to be a much more public thing than it is now. And so, yes, on the one hand, sharing your reading experiences on social media or by reading a book in public, yes, of course, you're communicating something about yourself. You're showing you're the type of person who read these books. But to assume that that's the primary thing that's occurring there, again, I think is where this article goes wrong. Just because I'm reading Tolstoy in public, it doesn't mean that my primary intention there is to convey to other people. I couldn't give a damn what other people think about what I'm reading. It's a hot sunny day. I don't want to be cooped up inside. The bar and the river are quite nice, and I'd like to go down there, read my book in peace, and I can still have that introspective relationship to the text while I'm doing that, and none of the fact that I'm in public impinges on this at all. In fact, one thing that I would say as well to add to that is that sometimes reading in public can augment your reading experiences. I remember once I read Howard's End, and it was in an English village by a cricket field. Some guys were playing cricket, my friends were playing chess, we were having a picnic. It was a very sunny day, and it augmented my experience of the book because the atmosphere I was in was very similar to the atmosphere of Howard's End. So actually, reading in that public context actually augmented my appreciation of that novel and my understanding of it, and it was one of the best readings I've ever had of Howard's End. I also question the final points about this article, where they seem to suggest that having these transformative experiences is ultimately introspective and about silence and keeping things to yourself. Again, I think this is more a product of how society has changed rather than anything intrinsic to reading. Reading is something that's predominantly done in private these days, but look at academics. I mean, academics produce content about their transformative reading experiences all the time. Now, average, run-of-the-mill person on TikTok or whatever is not going to have the, intellect to give you some rambling essay about, the virtues of some novel. But what she might be able to do, or he might be able to do, is share a raw emotional experience of how that book made them feel. And that seems just as legitimate to me than an academic producing some literary criticism about the book. It might not be as deep as what the literary critic is doing, but it's still an attempt to share a transformative reading experience through a method that works for that type of person. And so it comes across as a little bit, I don't usually like this word, but it does come across as a little bit elitist, because I'm sure the author would not apply the standard to literary academics. Another point that this article made was that somehow having extrinsic goals and reasons and motivations for your reading also inhibit your ability to have transformative reading experiences. And again, I use the example of academics because as an academic myself, I can tell you that there are lots of extrinsic pressures to publish articles, whether that's just the generic pressure to publish or the fact that you're working on a project that you've got a grant for, that outputs are demanded for. All of these things put pressures on academics to publish works, and they can still publish deeply insightful works about these transformative reading experiences. Likewise, students have lots of external pressures to read books. They have essays, deadlines, and all the rest of it, and they can still have transformative reading experiences. So this again is absolute nonsense. Just because someone is a content creator on a social media platform, and let's say they're trying to build a career out of that and money matters to them a lot, yes, that's going to be an extrinsic pressure, and maybe sometimes that can lead to people not reading books, but that's a very different thing. Someone who actually isn't reading something and there's evidence of that and then pretending to. I'm assuming that that's not the case, though. I'm assuming these people just like to produce content about books that they have read, and they use whatever social media platform works for them. And the fact that you have that pressure to produce content could encourage you to read more, just like the academic is encouraged to read more given certain extrinsic motivations. So the idea that just because you have extrinsic motivations, it will stop you from actually getting anything out of the book, I think is just unfounded. Of course, it would be nice if we could all just see the innate essence and value of reading, but we can't do that. Even me, I think that reading is important. Sometimes I do have to have external pressure. In fact, I would say starting this YouTube channel, especially in the early days, encouraged me to read a lot more, because I know that I want to keep making videos, and if I don't read anything, I can't make anything to talk about. And that's a completely extrinsic thing that's actually allowed me to engage with loads of books in a deep way and then talk about on this channel. So ultimately, I just think that this phenomenon of performative reading is largely nonsense. Of course, there are insincere people out there who pretend to read books and then bang on about it, and it's quite obvious people who do that. AI probably makes this worse, because now people could just get AI to write them a script or a summary about a book, and then superficially it seems like they know it. But let's be honest, anyone who's read a book, you can quickly tell whether or not someone is lying or telling the truth, because the minute it comes to the details of the novel, it all falls apart and they can't say anything. But ultimately, I don't think that is what is going on here. I think the guys who are reading in public are probably just enjoy reading, and it's a nice day and they want to read outside, and that's all there is to it. And it comes across as a little bit, like I say, like a double standard to, on the one hand, criticize men for not reading enough, and then when they do actually read and have the nerve to display that in public, having a go at them. And likewise, when it comes to the social media people, I think, so what? I mean, it might not be my thing to share things on Instagram or book talk, as they call it, but if someone wants to do that and they want to share their transformative reading experiences there in a way that is appropriate for them and in a way that they feel comfortable communicating, then more power to them. I don't really care. And I think rather than having these cynical attitudes to people who want to do something worthwhile, which is reading and discussing reading, why don't we look at this more positively as a good sign? I, for one, would rather live in a world where people are outside in public reading great novels rather than one where they're staring into the abyss of their mobile phone 24/7. But that's just me. What do you think down in the comments about this phenomenon? Do you agree with it, or do you think it's mostly just a load of nonsense like I do? Look forward to discussing that with you down in the comments. Until the next video, take care everyone. Ta-ra.